everyone. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Jamila Corbett. I'm a brand strategist, community builder, and the founder of the global community, I Am a Brand, where we help you build a purposeful and profitable personal brand through learning and collaboration. I am here with Branden Harvey to discuss how he's built a community of people who focus on the good in the world. Thank you so much for joining us, Branden.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. I want to start off by saying your mission is so beautiful, and oftentimes the media is so focused on the negativity, and a community like yours is so necessary now more than ever. I'm just curious to know, where did the spark to start this movement begin?
It happened absolutely on accident, which is kind of how a lot of things start in the world. But for me, my background is that I was a photographer. And I was traveling all over the world, getting flown out by nonprofits and brands to document stories in all kinds of places in the world. But the stories that always stuck out to me were the stories that connected me to people who I thought before that moment were totally different than me. So I'd be spending time in Uganda with these single mothers, and I'd get to know their stories and all of a sudden be like, oh, I connect with these people. And I think that through my process of traveling, I just learned a lot more about empathy and learned a lot more about the hope that's all over the world. And so I was like, what if I could give other people the same experience of experiencing what I've experienced? And so I started diving into figuring out ways to tell stories that mattered, stories that were hopeful. And so I've started just kind of pursuing that in all kinds of different ways. And I've found a community along the way of people who believe that focusing on empathy and hope and the good in the world actually matters. And so it's been a really fun process to get to move alongside those people from cynicism to optimism.
Yes. And so I know that Instagram is part of your storytelling method, and that's how you've built a community. But what other online tools or things have you done to build this community and to expand over the past year?
Yeah, so I started off on Instagram because I was a photographer, and Instagram was ultimately the first real big photo-based social network. So I was like, cool, I know how to take photos, I know how to share stuff, I'm going to put stuff on there. But along the way, I started finding other ways to tell compelling stories. And I also started growing in my ability to tell stories outside of photography. And so as I grew as somebody who understood video and storytelling and narratives, I actually jumped into Snapchat, which is a little bit goofy, but I was like, man, what if I took my audience on like hopeful, joyful adventures around the world? So I started doing that on Snapchat. A year ago, I started a podcast. It's called Sounds Good with Branden Harvey. And I have conversations with optimistic, hopeful people who have overcome a lot of difficult things in their life. I'm not talking to people who have just had an easy life and are happy. I'm talking to people who live with a sense of hope and joy despite the heartbreaking things that have happened to them. And then I also started this newsletter that's been so much fun. It's called The Good Newsletter. And every single week I send out an email to my community of optimists and world changers. And it's just got 5 things in it. It's got 5 stories of hopeful news from around the world. And the reason I started that was I was really inspired by this quote from Mr. Rogers. And Mr. Rogers tells this story where he says, when I was a boy and I would turn on the TV and there would be something scary happening, some sort of tragedy, something heartbreaking, my mom would always tell me to look for the helpers. You'll always find the helpers. And it's this idea that despite whatever is happening in the world that's hard or difficult, if you look to the edges of the screen, if you look into the phrase, if you look into the things that maybe the media is not talking about as much, or maybe people aren't giving as much attention to, you'll see that there's people coming in to make a difference and to fill the world with hope despite the brokenness. And so that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to say, what if we celebrated this? What if we looked for this? And there's a lot of good news in the world. And so I just send out that email every week. And so sharing content on Snapchat and Instagram and my podcast and newsletter has been so much fun. It's been such an encouragement to find that other people are interested in the same things. And I think it's helped all of us weather the craziness of 2016 and 2017.
Yeah. And what you're doing is amazing. And oftentimes we show a lot of our highlight reels on social media, but I know all of us experience challenges and obstacles. So what has been your biggest challenge so far with creating this type of community?
Absolutely. That's a really good question. For me, honestly, the biggest challenge is that I'm naturally an optimistic person. And if it were all up to me, I would always be right up here in the like high in the sky fluff of optimism. And that's just not the reality. Like that is not helpful to anybody. I think hope is important. I think optimism is important. But when you naturally ignore the brokenness in the world, if you naturally are ignoring tragedy or heartbreak or injustice, that's a really unhealthy thing. And so for me, the most difficult thing has been facing the brokenness of the world head on, actually confronting it, thinking about it, letting it like overwhelm me, and then find the hope within that and pull that out of there. Because that's way more meaningful. It's way more important. But honestly, it does not come naturally. It's really hard. But at the end of the day, it's really fulfilling and valuable.
Yeah, and what you're doing is so necessary, and you're a light bringer, and and I tell people this a lot is that light can only shine in the dark. So people like you are definitely needed in the world to shine your light during these quote unquote dark times. The craziness that's been happening, and so I'm sure someone's going to come across your story, be inspired, and in turn want to focus on doing good in the world and building an awesome community like you. But the thought of building a community or something bigger than themselves can be intimidating. What would you say to the individual that wants to start something bigger than themselves, but doesn't know where to start or exactly how to begin?
It's a great question. Ultimately, I would say start small. My community is nowhere as big as I'd love for it to be. I would love for everybody to be focusing on hope and optimism. And years ago, it was much smaller than this. But honestly, when it's small, then you can actually have a genuine community where you get to interact with your audience and you get to have conversations. And it's one of the things that I hate about my community growing over the last year or two has been that I don't get as much face-to-face time with these people who I love. I think that they're the most amazing people because we're exactly in line with each other's values and hopes and dreams. And so starting small is really valuable. Enjoy it while you can. And then over all of that, I would just say continue to follow your passions, continue to follow what you care about, because if you build a community around something that you're not very excited about, it's going to fizzle out. And so I feel like I finally found something where I actually am, I feel like I'm still searching. I'm still trying to get to the bottom of things. I don't know where like the hope comes from in the world. I don't know where like all the good people are, like I'm figuring it out. And that's been a really fun and exciting thing for me. And so every day when I get to lead this community and be a part of this, I actually really enjoy it.
And if I could sum up everything that you just said right now, it's enjoy the process. Don't, it's okay to start small and don't despise your small beginnings, but just enjoy the journey. Right?
Absolutely.
And so as we wrap up, how can people get in touch with you and connect with your community?
That's a great question. I'm so glad you asked. You can find me everywhere online at Branden Harvey. And Branden is spelled with an E-N, which is a little bit tricky. You'll see my goofy hair. It's out there. But then you can also visit brandenharvey.com, where you can subscribe to my podcast. It's called Sounds Good with Branden Harvey, available everywhere. And then more than anything, join the Good newsletter because it is such a refreshing thing for me to make every week. But I've heard from so many readers that it is a really great way to just kind of start off a week with a mentality of where can I see the good in the world.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today, Branden.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been incredible.
Awesome.